For my art-based awareness project, I decided to focus on Mary 2X Earley. She was a Mohawk woman from Ganawage, Quebec, born in 1911. Mary had lost her Indian status after marrying a non-Indigenous man. Um, and because of that, she became a human rights activist and major advocate for Indigenous women and children's rights in Canada. So in the Indian Act, there was a lot of discriminatory um, laws. Specifically, they were very sexist towards women, specifically by removing their Indigenous status. And so she created a movement that ended up being nationwide across Canada. And she was able to help restore federal law and to help thousands of Indigenous women. So that's what we're going to talk about here. I chose to do my project on Mary 2X Early because she's an amazing example of how one person's voice can change the world. She turned her own experience of oppression into a fight that lasted her over 20 years. And she didn't just fight for herself, but she also fought for thousands of women who have been silenced and excluded, including their children. As a social work student, I connected with her story because it represents what social work is all about: advocating for equity, amplifying marginalized voices, and challenging systems that cause harm. I found that not many people know her story, at least not in my world. Mary's work impacted and reshaped Canadian law and helped to restore cultural identity for future generations of Indigenous families. And I think that her story deserves to be known and shared. So, yeah, that's why I decided to choose her. The main source that I used for my project was the short film Married to X Early I Am Indian Again. It was directed by Courtney Montour and produced by the National Film Board of Canada. The film tells Mary's story through her own words for the majority. It uses footage from her interviews and her speeches. And they also brought in friends of hers and people that she knew who could also help to tell her story and what it was like. Um, it really stood out to me how personal her activism was. It was really rooted in community, and you could see how much she cared for her people and Indigenous women who were being cut off from their families and culture. And you could see that that really fueled her fight. The title comes from something that Mary had said once the law finally changed over in 1985, and women were officially able to regain back their legal status. Um, I also, aside from this source, had read some stuff from the Canadian Encyclopedia and Indigenous Foundations by UBC, which helped me to better understand Mary's story and the Indian Act better, just so I had a better grasp of everything that was going on, especially as a white woman. This isn't something that I've looked a lot into, so I did my best to get a bigger grasp on things. Mary faced several forms of discrimination and oppression throughout her lifetime, gender oppression being one of them. So, under the Indian Act, a woman's legal status and identity were directly tied to a man's. So, if an Indigenous woman wanted to marry a non Indigenous or non status man, she would lose her own status. However, if a man was to do the same and an Indigenous man married a non Indigenous woman, he was able to keep his status. So there was clearly a lot of inequalities going on there. And it just went to show how colonial law imposed a patriarchal system onto these Indigenous communities. Secondly, there's racial oppression. So in the Indian Act, it was designed by a Eurocentric system and lens. Um, and the government essentially dictated who was and who wasn't considered Indigenous. Obviously, that is not something that the European white government of Canada should be able to decide, and that should be left to Indigenous communities to decide for themselves. Um, Moving on, there's cultural oppression that she faced. These rules didn't just affect Indigenous people legally, but it also tore their families apart. Women lost their status and couldn't live on their reserves or inherit land. They couldn't be buried with their families or ancestors. And that really just cut off a big piece of community, and cuts off their language and their land. And in most indigenous communities, women were traditionally in roles of leadership, so that was also stripped away from them by imposing um, this system onto their communities. So all of these forms of oppression uh, were systemic, meaning that they weren't just one-time acts of discrimination imposed by somebody, but they were rules and laws built into the Canadian government. So yeah, Mary's activism began in the 1960s, when she started speaking out after seeing Indigenous women being evicted from their communities. She started small, so having small meetings within her home with women who have also lost their status. She talked to them about what she learned about with the law, and then helped them to write letters and petitions. And she went so far as to, if women couldn't make the meeting, she would go to their houses personally and let them know kind of what they missed and fill them in. Her work eventually grew into a national movement. So, pretty well, most Canadian politicians at that time knew who she was. She helped found the Equal Rights for Native Women Association, which later became the Indian Rights for Indian Women organization, which helped to unite Indigenous women from all across Canada and demand change. Mary spoke at Parliament. She wrote to the federal government. She's testified in the House of Commons and the Senate. And many Indigenous leaders, unfortunately, as well as politicians, mostly male politicians, told her to stop. Uh, but Mary refused to. And thankfully, she did refuse to, because more than 20 years later of being very persistent, her advocacy paid off, and the Canadian government passed Bill C-31 in 1985. This was an amendment to the Indian Act, which finally removed the gender discrimination from it. So women who had lost their status as well as their children were officially recognized again as Indigenous under the law, and they were able to regain their status. Mary received lots of awards throughout her lifetime, and she received national recognition. She was awarded the Governor General's Persons Award in 1979. She received an honorary doctorate of law from York University in Toronto. She was made an officer of the National Order of Quebec in 1985, and she was also given the National Aboriginal Achievement Award in 1996, just to name a few. Mary's story connects to colonial and patriarchal systems that are built into Canadian law. The Indian Act was a system of control that imposed European and patriarchal views onto Indigenous communities. So that replaced their traditional systems, where women were often held in leadership roles and had a strong influence within their communities. By defining Indigenous identity through male lineage, the act really stripped women of their rights and their voices, and their place within their communities as well. This shows how deeply social systems shape identity and belonging and gender roles, especially when they're built on colonial foundations. Her story shows an ongoing need for decolonization and systemic reform, especially as future social workers. We have to look at these structures that are in place, and inequities and inequalities, and challenge them, so that we can help to make changes that are necessary. For my art, I chose to do like a visual poster. I titled it "I Am Now Indian Again" because after the passing of Bill C-31, Mary had written over an envelope that contained the government letter that reinstated her Indigenous status. I am now Indian again. On the left side, I chose to focus more on the oppressions she faced. So I put section 12(1)(b). So that was in reference to that section in the Indian Act that she was trying to change. I put The words denied her voice, her land, her rights, to show what the Indian Act was taking from her. And then I put the words set my sisters free, because that was a quote from her in her speech in 1983 at a conference on Indigenous rights in the Canadian Constitution. And it just was a powerful plea that I found. On the right side, I focus more on her accomplishments. So I put Bill C-31, 1985, to mark the changes that she was able to move in order to remove the gender based discrimination from the Indian Act. I put restored Indian status to thousands of women and children because it shows how big of the impact she made, and how not only it affected those women and children, but also future generations. Um, and then I also put women's right and equality because she helped to restore that in so many ways. And I chose this photo of her smiling because she looks so happy. And after a 20-year fight, I felt like that was the right photo to use for her. So finally, what can we learn from Mary 2X Early? I think her story has taught me specifically that oppression isn't always personal and that it is often systemic. The discrimination that she faced wasn't because of one person's actions against her, but it was because of the laws and institutions that were designed to disadvantage Indigenous communities. So that's something important, I think, to understand going into social work, because if we focus on individual problems only, we're really missing the bigger systems that create these problems in the first place. I also think that her story shows that generational change is possible. She didn't live to see every problem solved. However, she was able to lay the groundwork that continues to help Indigenous women today. It reminds us that the progress that we make as social workers, that we hope to make as social workers, takes a lot of time and patience, and essentially not to give up, because while we might not live long enough to see the changes that we hope to be made, we might still be able to lay the foundation for it like Mary did. Also, I think a really key important takeaway is the importance of intersectionality. So, understanding how race and gender and culture and identity can all overlap to shape a person's experience. And so, I think that we should all be reminded and can be reminded by Mary's story, the importance of that. And finally, her life really can remind us that we can't just sit and observe the injustices that our system cause. Rather, we should challenge the system itself. So she saw the oppressions going on within her community, and instead of just sitting back and hoping for someone else to make a change, as so many of us do, she decided to challenge that and take action. And I found that to be really inspiring. So that's everything. And I hope you enjoyed learning about Mary as much as I did. Thank you.